On December 31st, 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a piece of paper. It was a royal charter, a trading license. Nothing more on the surface. The kind of bureaucratic document that fills archives and bores historians. But this particular document was different. It gave a group of London merchants the exclusive right to trade with the East Indies. It gave them the power to make laws, to wage war, to mint their own coins. It created a corporation, and over the next 250 years, that corporation would conquer an empire, control the lives of 1/4 of the world's population, and then, almost as quickly as it had risen, collapse into scandal and ruin. This is the story of the British East India Company, the most powerful corporation in human history, and the blueprint for every multinational you've ever heard of. To understand how a trading company became an empire, you need to understand what the world looked like in 1600. Europe was hungry, not for food, for spice. Pepper, nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves. These weren't luxuries, they were preservatives, medicines, and currency. A sack of nutmeg in Amsterdam in 1600 was worth more than a sailor's annual wages. Wars had been fought over them. Countries had been discovered looking for them. The problem was geography. The spice trade was controlled by middlemen, Ottoman merchants who sat at the crossroads between East and West and charged whatever they liked. Every gram of pepper that reached London had already passed through a dozen hands, each taking their cut. The Portuguese had found a solution: sail around Africa. But by 1600, Portugal was controlled by Spain, and England and Spain were enemies. England needed a new route, a new method, a new kind of organization. Enter 218 London merchants. They pooled their money, around £70,000, the equivalent of roughly £10 million today, and formed a joint stock company. This was revolutionary. Instead of one wealthy backer risking everything, hundreds of investors shared the risk. Profits and losses spread across them all. They called it the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. History would call it the East India Company. Their first fleet sailed in 1601, 5 ships, 500 men, and instructions to trade peacefully wherever they landed. Peacefully, for now. The early years were messy. The company fought the Dutch for access to the Spice Islands. It lost, badly. In 1623, Dutch colonial officers tortured and executed 10 English traders on the island of Amboina in what became known as the Amboina Massacre. England was furious, but too weak to retaliate. So the company pivoted. It turned its attention to India. In 1612, company ships defeated a Portuguese fleet off the coast of Surat. The Mughal Emperor Jahangir, ruler of an empire that produced roughly 1/4 of the world's GDP, was impressed. He granted the company trading rights. It was a foothold, a tiny one, but the company knew what to do with footholds. Over the next decades, it established trading posts called factories in Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. These weren't factories in the modern sense. They were fortified warehouses, commercial embassies, little islands of English rule in a foreign land. Then came the pivotal moment, 1757, the Battle of Plassey. The company's military commander, Robert Clive, a former clerk with no formal military training, led a force of roughly 3,000 soldiers against a Mughal army of 50,000. He shouldn't have won. But Clive had done something other than fight. He had bribed. He had conspired with Mir Jafar, the commander of the Mughal forces, promising to make him Narag Bengal if he betrayed his own ruler. On the morning of June 23, 1757, Mir Jafar's troops stood down. The Mughal army collapsed from within. The company won Bengal, the richest province in India, in a battle that lasted approximately 11 hours. And then came the money. Robert Clive personally pocketed £234,000 from the Mughal treasury, roughly £30 million in today's money. He later told the British Parliament that, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, he was astonished at his own moderation. The company wasn't fighting for trade anymore, it was fighting for territory. By 1800, the East India Company had its own army, 200,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army itself. It had its own currency, its own laws, its own courts. It collected taxes, it declared wars, it made treaties with kings. It was, in every meaningful sense, a state, a private state, owned by shareholders, answerable, in theory, to a board of directors sitting in a building on Leadenhall Street in London. One company, 250 million people under its rule. How do you control a continent with a spreadsheet? That was the company's central problem, and it solved it with 3 tools: taxation, opium, and deliberate neglect. Let's start with taxation. When the company took control of Bengal in 1757, it inherited the Mughal tax system. But where the Mughals had collected roughly 10% of agricultural output, the company increased that to 50% and enforced it with soldiers. Farmers who couldn't pay lost their land. Weavers who tried to sell their cloth to other buyers had their thumbs cut off, so the company's records claim. The results were catastrophic. In 1769 and 1770, famine swept through Bengal. 10 million people died, roughly 1/3 of the entire population of the province. The company's response? It actually increased tax collection during the famine to compensate for lower revenue. Then there was opium. The company had a trade problem. It was buying enormous quantities of silk, tea, and cotton from China, and China didn't want to buy anything back. Silver was flowing out of Britain at an alarming rate. The solution the company found was not a product, it was a poison. Bengal grew opium. The company monopolized its production and smuggled it into China by the ton, bypassing the Chinese government's strict ban. By the 1830s, there were an estimated 12 million opium addicts in China. When China tried to stop the trade, when Commissioner Lin Zexu destroyed over 1,000 tons of company opium in 1839, Britain went to war. The Opium Wars, fought to protect a drug dealer's supply chain. And yet, back in London, the company's shareholders were delighted. Dividends were high, the stock price was rising, the machine was working. But machines break. The end came from an unexpected place, Greece. In 1857, the company issued a new rifle to its Indian soldiers, the sepoys, the Enfield Pattern 1853. To load it, soldiers had to bite off the end of a paper cartridge. The rumor spread, and it was probably true, that the cartridges were greased with a mixture of beef fat and pork fat. Beef, sacred to Hindus, pork, forbidden to Muslims. It was an act of staggering cultural blindness, or perhaps arrogance. The company had ruled India for a century and still managed to insult every soldier in its army simultaneously. On May 10, 1857, sepoys at Meerut refused their orders. They shot their British officers, freed their imprisoned comrades, and marched on Delhi. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, called the Sepoy Mutiny by the British, the first war of independence by many Indians, spread across northern India in weeks. The violence was brutal on both sides. In Kanpur, British men, women, and children were massacred. In Delhi, British forces retook the city and carried out reprisals so savage that the city's population, 3/4 of whom had nothing to do with the rebellion, fled. But the rebellion did something the company's enemies had never managed. It ended the fiction that a trading company could govern a nation, that shareholders answering to no one but profit could be trusted with the lives of hundreds of millions of people. On August 2nd, 1858, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act. The East India Company was dissolved. Queen Victoria assumed direct control of India. The British Raj had begun. After 257 years, the most powerful corporation in history was finished. Not by a rival nation, not by bankruptcy, but by its own hubris, by the belief that a spreadsheet could replace a conscience. Here is what is remarkable about the East India Company. It was not a government. It had no democratic mandate. It was not elected, not appointed, not chosen by the people it ruled. It was a business that collected taxes from 250 million people, a business that fought wars, installed kings, and decided, through paperwork and policy, who would eat and who would starve. Today, we live in a world of multinational corporations with revenues larger than most countries. We live in a world where private companies build and operate critical infrastructure, where tech platforms make decisions that affect billions of people, where a handful of shareholders can redirect the lives of entire nations. We look at the East India Company as a historical aberration, a cautionary tale from a more brutal age. But is it? Or is it a mirror? The company didn't start with the intention to conquer anything. It started with 218 merchants and a desire for profit. The violence, the famines, the opium, none of it was the plan. It was the consequence, the logical endpoint of prioritizing return on investment over everything else. Every era gets the East India Company it deserves. The question is, which one are we building? If this story made you think, subscribe, because next week we're going deeper into the economic catastrophes that shaped the modern world. The story is far from over.